Within Aizen's army, there's one character who really stands out. It's Coyote Starrk, the primera Espada. When fans talk about some of the most powerful characters within Bleach, Stark's name often gets overshadowed by Ulquiorra thanks to his segunda etapa, or Yami's resurrection and his reveal as the zero-ranking Espada, or even Barragan with his borderline unfair ability Respira. Stark is so different from the other Espada that it really confuses me as to why he's often overlooked in discussions of both character writing as well as power scaling. When you actually sit down and pull apart everything that Kubo's embedded within Stark's character, from the lore to the symbolism to even the details Kubo himself has confirmed on his fan club outside, you'll quickly realize just how misunderstood Stark is within the fandom. Maybe a part of this comes down to expectations, as naturally Bleach fans would want their number one ranking Espada to behave like the primera number one Espada. Via multiple characters, we've gotten used to that intimidation, arrogance, and that dramatic power reveal factor, but honestly Stark doesn't give us any of this. His personality is the type where he'd rather go home and sleep. He refuses to perform or live up to that expectation because he's that laid back and unmotivated, and he treats war like a mild inconvenience. People write him off as boring or weak or undeserving of his rank. In my opinion, this couldn't be further from the truth, so in this video I want to break down why Coyote Starrk is the single most misunderstood Espada in all of Bleach. But you know which laid back Bleach characters are never misunderstood? These are the individuals who are subscribed to the channel. Only 20% of the people who watch these videos are subscribed, so if you enjoy this content and want to see more, then hit the bell notification and the subscribe button. To understand why Stark is misunderstood, you need to first realize what he actually is. At his core, Stark is something that shouldn't really exist. Before he ever met Aizen, before the Espada were even a concept, there was a Vasto wandering the sands of Hueco Mundo, and his spiritual pressure was so catastrophically immense that every hollow who came near it simply died. This wasn't because the Vasto was attacking or unleashing a devastating technique, they simply ceased to exist because they couldn't withstand the sheer density of this creature's Reiatsu. We see the aftermath of this in Stark's backstory during chapters 374 and 375, where he and Lilynet are sitting in front of literal mountains of hollow corpses. Aizen approaches them and asks if they had killed all of these hollows, but Stark tells them no, they just died on their own. This line is quietly one of the most unsettling within Bleach, as the tragedy is that the original being, the Vasto that Stark was, didn't want to be alone. It tried to exist alongside other hollows, but they kept dying every single time. He was so powerful that the very thing that he had wanted the most, which was companionship, was the one thing that his existence had made impossible. During this time, Stark did the only thing that he could think of. He split his own soul in half, creating two separate beings, Stark and Lilynet. Stark himself doesn't even remember what their original form looked like, but he speculates that it resembled neither of them. The logic behind the split was simple, as they wanted to become weak. They envied the weak because the weak could travel in packs. The weak could have friends and companions without killing them, and if becoming weak was impossible, then they at least wanted to find someone as strong as they were. Other Arrancar sealed their power within a Zanpakuto, as hollow abilities get compressed into a blade, and when you release, that power comes flooding back. Stark's power was so enormous that it couldn't be contained in a sword. It required an entirely separate sentient being to hold it. Lilynet is functionally his Zanpakuto in physical form. No other Arrancar in the entire series has this. The size of a Zanpakuto in Bleach is relative to the wielder's spiritual pressure. Stark managed to condense his Reiryoku into the smallest possible form, and that was a living, breathing, talking person. This should give a bit of a glimpse into the scale of power that we're dealing with when it comes to Stark. The Bleach Databook 3 Unmasked confirms that both Stark and Ulquiorra are among two known natural-born Arrancar whose powers surpass those created artificially by Aizen via the Hokyoku. The rest of the Espada needed the Hokyoku to unlock their potential. Stark was pretty much already there. He was so naturally powerful that even even the Hokyoku felt redundant. On top of that, the manga confirms in chapter 345 that the top 4 Espada are forbidden from releasing their Zanpakuto inside of Las Noches because their resurrections could destroy the fortress. Stark sits at the very top of this elite group. Even Stark's name carries meaning which ties back to his isolation. His first name Coyote directly references the animal. Coyotes are known to travel and live in family packs, but it's actually more common to see one hunting and traveling on its own. Coyotes who spend part of their lives separated from their pack are called solitary coyotes. I believe the coyote in his name is a deliberate nod to this. A lone traveler, and his released form, which materializes a pack of wolves, represents his longing to belong to that pack which he never had. This might not be the case, but it's still an interesting interpretation of his name and release. This now brings us to one of the more interesting reveals to come out of Kubo's fan club Club Outside. In question answer 674, a fan asked Kubo directly, how strong is Stark really? His abilities don't seem as deadly as Baragon's, so is it primarily his immense spiritual pressure that puts him on top? And did he join Aizen's ranks only after Aizen acquired the Hokyoku? Kubo's response confirms something huge. Aizen was aware of Stark's existence even before Stark had become an Arrancar. He sensed that original Vasto Lore's power, likely during the same period he was conquering Hueco Mundo and dethroning Baragon. But here's a important detail. Aizen decided to wait. He was aware that confronting Stark could have been too difficult to deal with, so he held off until after he had secured the Hokyoku and the situation was a bit more settled. Aizen walked into Baragon's throne room during this time with Gin and Tozen by his side, humiliated the king of Hueco Mundo and stripped him of everything. Baragon's personality made him an easy mark. He was volatile, power-hungry, and predictable, so Aizen knew exactly what buttons to press. But Stark was a very different situation. When Aizen eventually does approach Stark, look at how the scene plays out. He comes alone without Gin and Tozen. He is uncharacteristically subdued in the interaction. There's none of the trademark arrogance or wordplay. When Stark observes that Aizen seems strong, Aizen responds with a simple, "Who knows?" That's not the Aizen we know. This is him being careful. Compare this to how he completely upended and exploited Baragon's arrogance. With Baragon, Aizen was a conqueror. With Stark, he almost seemed respectful, like he didn't want to step on anyone's toes. And Kubo added something else within the Q&A that's easily glossed over. He stated that Stark is a very difficult character to read even for Aizen. Aizen's been dubbed as a master of manipulation. He thrives on understanding people, knowing their desires and weaknesses so that he can exploit them. But if Stark is someone that even Aizen can't fully figure out, that makes him dangerous in a way that Baragon never really was. Baragon's inherently predictable, and in that predictability lies vulnerability for him. Aizen sought out Stark without knowing how he was going to react. But thankfully for him, things turned out well. Stark happened to want the exact same thing that Aizen was offering, allies as powerful as himself. During these early scenes, we see Baragon interacting with other hollows and their existence remains perfectly intact around him. If this was the original Stark sitting on Baragon's throne instead, every single one of those hollows would have been dead simply by being near him. The original Stark was far above Baragon in terms of raw, latent spiritual energy, and he was very likely the single strongest hollow in existence within the manga. Most Bleach villains are defined by ambition. Baragon wants his throne back, Grimmjow wants to prove that he's the strongest, Noitora craves a worthy death, Xyle Aparo is obsessed with perfection. Ukiura is consumed by nihilism and his inability to understand the heart. Las Noches is basically a nest of individuals with huge egos, and each one of them is scheming behind each other's backs. They are all really serving their own agendas, and they're doing this under the guise of loyalty to Aizen. But you have Stark on the other hand, who couldn't care less about any of this. His entire motivation from start to finish can be summed up in a single word, which is companionship, and he already has it by the time that he's introduced within the story. Unlike virtually every other hollow in Bleach, Stark got what he was chasing the moment that he arrived at Las Noches. Every other Espada was taken in by promises of greater power or respect or territory, but Stark just needed people who wouldn't die by being around him, and Aizen essentially delivered this to him. This makes his relationship with Aizen unlike anything else among the Espada. Aizen was, was, in the most unlikely way, Stark's salvation. For the first time in his existence, he found companions who could withstand his presence. The Espada as a group became the closest thing that he ever had to a real family, and even though Stark almost certainly recognized that Aizen was using all of them as tools, he didn't care. The allies that he gained were real. The fact that Aizen had ulterior motives didn't erase the fact that Stark was no longer alone, and that mattered more to him than anything. His aspect of death is solitude, and unlike a lot of the other aspects of death, it doesn't define his fighting style or his abilities in a flashy way. It defines his entire existence. Stark's overwhelming power created the loneliness. His loneliness drove him to split his soul, and this split shapes everything else that follows with Stark's character. Kubo originally conceived the Espada as embodying the 7 deadly sins, and under that framework, Stark would have represented sloth. His laziness and his reluctance to fight incredibly powerful opponents like Shunsui made him a natural fit for this sin. But when Kubo shifted to aspects of death, Stark became something much deeper. Solitude isn't a sin, it's a condition, and it turns Stark from a simple archetype into one of the most emotionally resonant characters during that portion of Bleach's story. Naturally, you have people questioning whether if Stark was even truly a villain. He had no real issue with the Soul Society, he has no desire to see humans killed, and he abhors having to take Orihime back to Aizen, openly telling her it's a pain for him. When Baragon dies and Aizen doesn't so much as acknowledge it, Stark is visibly affected. He calls it horrible, and he does fall into a bit of a depression. He openly tells Lynette that he knows Aizen isn't going to save them, that their opponents are too strong, that continuing will only result in more deaths, and that he'd rather just go home and sleep. He's a villain by association only, as he fights because he owes a debt to the person who freed him from a lifetime of isolation, and this debt appears to supersede everything else. He does tend to pre-warn his opponents whenever he's about to do something that he'd prefer not to do, whether if it's taking Orihime or unleashing his full power. He gives people a chance to back down, and this isn't a trait that you would expect from a villain. Now let's talk about the main reason why Stark often gets written off by fans. The combat feats that he has demonstrated don't really live up to what you'd expect from the Primera Espada, and I do get that. Baragon had Respira, which aged anything that it touched to dust. Ukiara had Segunda Etapa, this jaw-dropping second release that pushed him into a completely different tier of power. Stark's main thing is literally shooting Ceros, and a lot of them. Well, yeah, he's able to do this really fast, but to the average viewer, this just isn't going to hit the same way. When you actually break down what Stark does during the Fate Karakura Town arc, the picture does change. Let's begin with speed. Before his fight with Shunsui even begins, Stark effortlessly extracted Orihime while at the same time evading both Ichigo and Kinpachi. He crossed the city-sized interior of Las Noches instantaneously, while maintaining this characteristic apologetic demeanor the entire time. This is still one of the most impressive speed feats in Bleach, and people just kind of forget about it. Then there's his combat feats in his unreleased form. Before he even activates Los Lobos, Stark fights both Shunsui and Ukitake at the same time. These are two of the oldest and most experienced Shinigami in the Gotei 13. And Stark's matching them blow for blow while spending half of the fight commenting on the other fights happening around him. He notices Hitsugaya's Bankai and casually asks Shunsui if all the captains have such impressive abilities. I mean, while up against such a serious opponent, he's behaving like a spectator. His analytical ability is where things get a bit frightening. Within moments of crossing blades with Shunsui, Stark completely decoded his dual-wielding fighting style. Shunsui was actively trying to hide how he uses his two swords, even lying to Stark about it when Stark correctly guessed the truth. Shunsui himself acknowledged that this was scary. Then there's Ukitake's Shikai Sogyo no Kotowari, the absorption-based ability. Stark figures out its mechanics after witnessing it only 3 times. His Sero mastery alone deserves a lot more credit than it gets. Unlike other Espada who need specific stances or prep time, Stark can fire Sero from any part of his body instantaneously without even assuming assuming a combat position. The BLEACH databook Unmasked confirms his ability to generate infinite Seros given sufficient spiritual pressure. Sero Metroletta, his signature barrage technique, produces blasts that are so dense and grouped together that they appear to merge into a single overwhelming wave of destruction. A single barrage of this was enough to make Shunsui seriously contemplate activating his Bankai. A major part that BLEACH fans consistently fail to appreciate is that everything that we've talked about here is from a version of Stark who was openly holding back. He says so himself. He tells Shunsui that this whole situation is against his nature, that if it were up to him, they'd both pretend to fight while the others did the hard work. He asks Shunsui not to worry because he won't fight at his best either. When Stark gets serious, it's because Lilynette talks some sense into him. She reminds him that Aizen gave him the #1 position for a reason, and that if he truly doesn't want his friends to die, he needs to fight, and it's only then, where he's motivated purely by the desire to protect his remaining comrades, that Stark reveals what might be the most broken ability that any Espada possesses. The wolves are fragments of Stark and Lilynette's own soul. They have manifested into physical form. Each one is capable of independent thought, tactical coordination, and explosive detonation upon contact. These are actual pieces of Stark's essence, and they are not simply energy constructs. And he's able to keep splitting his soul to create more of these wolves seemingly without limit. It's a continuation of the very first time that Stark and Lilynette split from their original form into two beings, except now they're doing it over and over again and creating an army. The moment the wolves appear, Love and Rose are completely overwhelmed. They don't even get close to Stark's main body. He just sits back and watches the devastation unfold without even lifting a finger. The wolves phase through every attempt to destroy them, almost ethereal in the way that they dodge and weave around attacks. And when the wolves do get destroyed, they easily reform. What makes the ability terrifying on a conceptual level is the 0 degree of separation between user and technique. The wolves are Stark, and there's no external mechanism to target or energy source to cut off. As long as Stark and Lilynette are alive, the wolves should be functionally infinite. His spiritual reserves are vast enough to sustain hundreds of these entities while maintaining his own lethality. Each wolf detonates with enough force to produce an explosion that absolutely dwarfs the buildings below, but somehow fans barely talk about this incredible ability. Comparing it to Respira, Barragan's entire fight revolves around overcoming Respira. It gets dedicated screen time, multiple characters react to it with horror, and the method of defeating it becomes the centerpiece of the story. The wolf pack gets a single chapter of dominating before it inexplicably vanishes when Shunsui stabs Stark from behind. In the manga, the wolves disappear from this point forward, and the fight shifts to Shunsui changing the game to Irouni. The most likely explanation for this is that Kubo needed the fight to end, and he recognized that the wolves would present a huge problem for Shunsui that he wouldn't have easily been able to write around. So effectively they were written out. This is really frustrating because the wolves never got to cause real damage against the opponent who actually matters. Love and Rose going down is really cool, but Shunsui is the true measure of Stark's power. The anime makes this situation worse by having the wolves appear weaker and less reliable, with Lilynette's soul residing in one of them and dying as a sacrifice to protect Stark. This wasn't in the manga at all. In the manga, Lilynette seemingly disappears after merging with Stark when he uses the wolf pack. After Shunsui stabs Stark through the back by emerging from his shadow using Kage Oni, Stark generates a spiritual energy sword called Kolmido, and he matches Shunsui's jewel blade Shikai directly. Then Shunsui initiates a game called Irouni where you name a color and can only cut that color, but the riskier the color you choose for yourself, the more damage you deal. Shunsui calls grey and slashes Stark's right arm. Stark takes the wound and immediately understands the rules. On his very first turn, he calls white and manages to cut Shunsui's back, which results in a disproportionately large gush of blood because white is a high risk color for both of them. Shunsui is genuinely amazed at how quickly Stark picked up the game. As he admits admits that he's a tough opponent. During all of this, Stark is thinking to himself that he could say the same thing about Shunsui, wondering why he has to fight someone this strong. There's this undercurrent of disappointment running through the entirety of this fight. Stark had pointed out earlier in the battle that Shunsui was behaving out of character, attacking from behind, trying to cut off his head mid-conversation, as Stark tells him to stop it because it isn't like him. He says this because he believed that they were similar people, two lazy fighters who'd rather let others do the hard work. Shunsui's response to this is fascinating. He tells Stark not to tell him how he's like, that he behaves however he wants, but Shunsui knows. The somber expression he wears as Stark falls tells you everything. He didn't enjoy this. He killed a man that he kind of respected, a man that he had more in common with than probably any of his actual enemies. The Espada ranking system itself has contributed massively to the misunderstanding of Stark. Fans have spent years arguing about whether if Baragon or Ulquiorra deserve the #1 spot over Stark, building tier lists and power scaling frameworks based on numbers that were never meant to be taken at face value. The Espada ranks represent aspects of death, not combined power tiers. Each number corresponds to a philosophical concept: solitude, aging, sacrifice, emptiness, despair, destruction, intoxication, madness, greed, and rage. So you can't meaningfully rank loneliness against decay or destruction against emptiness. Kubo confirmed on Club Outside that the Espada positions come with their respective aspects of death, and that characters who share a number share an aspect of death. When Luffy inherited the 6th position, he also got destruction as his aspect of death, similar to Grimmjow. Nell and Haribel share sacrifice because they share the 3rd position. Aizen actually created the ranking system as psychological warfare. Baragon's placement at number 2 is a calculated insult to him. It's a permanent reminder for him that the former king of Wiccamundo will never reclaim his throne and will never be number 1. Stark's placement at number 1 isolates him further, feeding into his solitude by making him the benchmark that everyone below him resents. Grimmjow's obsessive need to reclaim his number 6 tattoo isn't the behavior of someone who understands the rankings. It's the behavior of an individual psychologically conditioned to believe his worth is tied to an artificial number. Aizen designed the Espada ranking system to keep his army divided, competitive, and dependent on his approval, and we as Bleach fans fell for it just as hard as the Espada did. When Shunsui calls the color black during Iruuni and slashes Stark directly across his hollow hole, nearly cutting him in half, the wound cracks open and blood erupts from his chest. As Stark falls from the sky surrounded by his own blood, he doesn't feel enraged. He doesn't even curse his enemies or vow revenge. He thinks about the first time that he met Aizen. He apologizes for not being able to repay him, and then he remembers the other Espada, all of them walking together, and the creation of Lily-Ned. And in his dying moments, he realizes that he's not alone. He was never alone, not since Aizen found him. The Espada and Lily-Ned had given him exactly what he'd spent his existence searching for, and he hadn't fully appreciated it until his final moments. When Stark pictures the Espada in that final flashback, Yami doesn't appear. Every other Espada is there, but Yami's absent. Whether if this means Yami hadn't joined yet at that point, Stark is remembering, or whether if Stark simply didn't consider Yami part of his inner circle, this is a bit of a telling omission about who Stark views as his family. There's also the small story that Kubo tells via the sketches between chapters 372 through to 376. These are 5 pieces of art that when placed together show 2 wolves, one gets injured and the remaining wolf mourns, then both wolves are dead, and the final image shows 2 splatters of blood representing Stark and Lily-Net's bodies returning to nothingness. So it's assumed that they died together just as they'd lived together since the moment they split. Bleach Brave Souls actually explored what a fully realized Stark may look like via a Hokyoku-empowered resurrection form that Kubo himself designed. This version was created to commemorate the Can't Fear Unworld light novel. It mirrors Ulquiorra's own Hokyoku-enhanced transformation. The design features Stark with 2 hollow holes, each containing a Hokyoku, with cracked energy spreading across his torso and twin pistols redesigned to resemble Henry rifles that are adorned with wolf skulls. It's an interesting glimpse at what Stark could have become if he did survive, or if he were to have pushed beyond his limits. While fans would have wanted to see this and even more of Stark, the fascinating thing is that Stark wouldn't have been interested in any of this. He already got everything that he wanted. Stark is misunderstood because Bleach fans judge characters by their combat feats, their kill counts, and their flashy transformations. By those metrics, Stark does fall short, but if you judge him by what Kubo actually puts onto the page, by the lore and how he is written as a character, then he's easily one of the best characters that Kubo has written. Someone who is more than deserving of the Primera title. We have now reached the point of the video where I want to hand over the discussion to all of you. Do you think Stark has been misunderstood by the Bleach community, or do you think that his showings speak for themselves? Would you have liked to see his original Vasto lore form, or does the mystery add to his entire appeal? Do let me know your thoughts about Stark by continuing the discussion in the comments, and lastly, thanks for making it to the end of this one, and I look forward to seeing you in my next Bleach video.
A massive thank you goes out to all of my amazing Patreon supporters for helping to make this video possible. If you also want to support the channel and see your name in the end of my videos, then check out my Patreon, which has loads of perks like early video access and so much more. Thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.